This is the Heroes for Freedom podcast. I'm Rick Robinson with Sheridan, 20 miles away. This great Union Army had been completely surprised. That old Confederate fox, General Jubal Early, had swept in upon them at night. All seemed lost, and worse, a defeat now would lose the election for President Lincoln, his re-election. It would be a national disaster, in fact. But then, Sheridan arrived. In the immortal words of one of Phil Sheridan's boys at the time, he said this, quote, "The men sprang to their feet and cheered as only men about to be defeated can. Hope and confidence returned at a bound. No longer did we merely hope. The worst was now over. Now we all burned to attack the enemy, to drive him back, and to retrieve our honor. And every man there that day knew that Sheridan would do just that." Unquote. But how did the Union Army get in such a predicament in the first place? After critical Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg in July of 1863, many in the North began to believe that the Civil War was winding down and that this horribly brutal and divisive conflict would soon end. But as 1863 turned to the dark days of 1864, many citizens began to lose hope. The rebel South and their allies in the North, the so-called Copperhead Democrats, however, tasted blood in the water for the Lincoln administration. They knew that Lincoln could be beaten. Most of them believed that the upcoming national elections would ensure that Abraham Lincoln would go down in defeat because of the situation on the battlefront. For these Northern Democrats, incredibly, were seeking a peace treaty with the slaveholding South, allowing them to keep their slaves, with millions of human beings still in chains, just as long as the war would end and the Democrats, of course, would steal back their political power. But far worse, their peace agreement with the Confederate South included the permanent division of the country into two separate nations, the United States and the Confederate States. Weakened and divided, it is quite likely, as President Lincoln knew so well, that the rest of the American continent would end up dividing into 3, 4, perhaps even 10 different statelets, all perpetually hostile and at war with each other, some slaves, some free, and all weak and easily manipulated or overrun by foreign powers. When the next century would arrive, and that was only 35 years after their planned division of the country, the earth would be swept by the twin scourges of communism and Nazism in all their aggressive and toxic forms. In truth, the world could not survive without a strong, united, morally righteous United States to oppose such death-worshipping satanic cults. So by the fall of 1864, national elections just a month away, an event, a battle, probably not even a key battle at the time, would occur. But in its own way, this military confrontation in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia would be as critical as any fought in the entire war. Sweeping through the Shenandoah Valley, which was the breadbasket of the South, in fact, under the direction of General Ulysses S. Grant, the supreme commander of Union forces, General Philip Sheridan, fresh from victories at Winchester, Fisher's Hill, and Tom's Brook, had thought Confederate forces in the valley had finally been defeated and were gone. So he'd stopped to regroup and give his men a well-earned rest. Then he rode northeast to Washington, D.C. to meet with General Grant and other leaders to discuss further strategy. For the moment, however, Grant told Sheridan that he was to hold off from any further aggressive campaigns. The determined Sheridan, however, did not want to sit on his hands. This was not him, and it wasn't General Grant either. But General Grant fully understood the political realities going on. Grant wrote a letter later in his memoirs. He said, quote, "The Lincoln administration was afraid to have a decisive battle at that time for fear it might go against us, having a bad effect on the upcoming November elections," unquote. So Sheridan, visiting General Grant and anxious to get back to his men, left and rode to spend the night in Winchester, which was 20 miles from his army at Cedar Creek. His men now, in fact, were in harm's way. He did not know this as the night wore on. An army at rest and comfortable is always a potential target. And the South's wily leader, General Jubal Early, determined to return in the night and carry out a sneak attack against the unsuspecting troops of General Sheridan, while Sheridan was away and not with his men to rally them. As the Union Army bivouacked at Cedar Creek, as I mentioned, in Virginia, Jubal Early's men snuck in the night and attacked and began driving back Sheridan's 3 Union corps. The battle became desperate. It was bloody right away due to the surprise and ferocity of the attack. The Union Army, lacking its famed commander, was about to turn tail and run for home. One Union officer noted, describing the musket attack that came from the surrounding trees, quote, "Smoke and flames streamed out in a long line as though the whole forest had been suddenly ignited," unquote. Men fell everywhere as they pulled back. Everything they had accomplished was about to be wiped out. The Federals' lack of leadership and their carelessness about to undo them. Then, as his men turned to run, and after he'd ridden wild and hard for 20 miles, General Philip Sheridan suddenly arrived, sweeping in on his black steed, up and down the lines of men, rallying them to hold and then to counterattack with vengeance against Jubal Early's Confederates. And in a moment, the momentum shifted. The rebel lines crumbled, falling back, defeated and scattered. Again, one of Sheridan's boys, witnessing the general's magnificent return, said, quote, "The men sprang to their feet and cheered as only men about to be defeated can. Hope and confidence returned in a bound. No longer did we merely hope. The worst was now over. Now we all burned to attack the enemy, to drive him back and retrieve our honor. And every man there that day knew that Sheridan would do just that," unquote. Victory in this great and essential battle effectively ended the South's ability to fight in the Shenandoah Valley. One more nail in the coffin of the slaveholding South. But we know, as history so often demonstrates, there was much more to the story, much more at stake. An event, a victory that might have gone unnoticed, but for what was happening nationally at the political level at that very moment. For some events are hard to value when they occur. But President Lincoln's second term election, as we mentioned, was at the doorstep. And because people in the North were so incredibly weary of this war, the war that had gone on for nearly 4 years and seemed to never end, a war that had taken the lives of hundreds of thousands of mostly young American fathers, husbands, and sons. For hardly a family in both the North and the South had not lost someone. The United States was paying a horrendous price in blood, maimed lives, and treasure, far beyond what anyone had imagined 4 years earlier. Because of this, too many Americans in the North thought that such a cost was not worth it, that the Union was not worth saving or the slaves worth freeing. Therefore, people, as people too often are, were beginning to lose heart and hope and swing their support away from the Lincoln and the Republicans towards the Democratic candidate, George B. McClellan. The Democrats were promising they would end the war immediately, they would allow the South to break away from the United States, and permit the Confederacy to continue the unholy institution of slavery. It was not what most Northerners wanted, but continued losses on the battlefield seemed to prove that the North and the Union could not possibly win this war. So they thought, why prolong the agony? I must hammer this point home again and again if I have to. Can one man or woman make a difference in our world? You tell me, for that single victory by General Philip Sheridan and his loyal men turned public opinion around. Enough people in the North began to believe that victory was indeed possible, that the slaves, they could be freed, and the Union saved. So, from what appeared a losing campaign just before the battle, Lincoln won a solid victory that next month, earning a second term as president. Critically, more important, this victory ensured that there would be no divisive treaty offered to the Confederacy, which Lincoln's opponent, George B. McClellan, would have signed immediately. Thus, by surviving that crossroads election, Lincoln saved the Union and finished slavery once and for all. Celebrating this shift of momentum in the campaign, Sheridan's key victory that it produced, which appeared in the New York Tribune just days before the national elections, the following poem by Thomas Buchanan Reed was created and published. The words of this stirring quatrain likely impacting the outcome of the election and immortalizing General Philip Sheridan for all time. It's titled Sheridan's Ride by Thomas Buchanan Reed. Up from the South at break of day, bringing to Winchester fresh dismay, the affrighted air with a shudder bore, like a herald in haste to the chieftain's door, the terrible grumble and rumble and roar, telling the battle was on once more, and Sheridan 20 miles away. Jubal Early's men have arrived. The sneak attack has taken place. And whiter still, those billows of war thundered along the horizon's bar, and louder yet, into Winchester rolled the roar of that Red Sea uncontrolled, making the blood of the listener cold as he thought of the stake in that fiery fray, and Sheridan 20 miles away. But there is a road from Winchester town, a good broad highway leading down, and there through the flush of the morning light, a steed as black as the steeds of night was seen to pass as with eagle flight, as if he knew the terrible need. He stretched away with his utmost speed. Hills rose and fell, but his heart was gay with Sheridan 15 miles away. Still sprung from those swift hooves thundering south, the dust like smoke from the cannon's mouth, or the trail of a comet sweeping faster and faster, foreboding to traders the doom of disaster. The heart of the steed and the heart of the master were beating like pistons, assaulting their walls, impatient to be where the battlefield calls. Every nerve of the charger was strained to full play, with Sheridan only 10 miles away. Under his spurning feet, the road like a arrowy alpine river flowed. The steed, like a warship fed with furnace ire, swept on with his wild eyes full of fire. But lo, he is nearing his heart's desire. He is snuffing the smoke of the roaring fray, with Sheridan only 5 miles away. The first that the general saw were the groups of stragglers, and then his retreating troops. What was done, what to do, a glance told him both. Then striking his spurs with a terrible oath, he dashed down the line mid a storm of hurrahs, and the wave of retreat checked its course there, because the sight of the master compelled it to pause. With foam and with dust the black charger was gray, but by the flash of his eye and the red nostrils' play, he seemed to the whole great army to say, "I have brought you Sheridan, all the way from Winchester down to save the day. Hurrah, hurrah for Sheridan! Hurrah for horse and man!" And when their statues are placed on high, under the dome of the Union sky, the American soldier's temple of fame, there, with the glorious general's name, be it said in letters both bold and bright, here is the steed that saved the day by carrying Sheridan into the fight from Winchester, 20 miles away. I'm Rick Robison. I appreciate your time. This is the Heroes for Freedom podcast.